In this video, we will be making rolled cookies. Rolled cookies are most often found in the form of sugar cookies or gingerbread cookies. And for this video, we'll be preparing a recipe called Graham's Sugar Cookies. One of the nice things about this particular sugar cookie recipe is, unlike most sugar cookie recipes, it does not have to be refrigerated for hours before it can be rolled out. It can be rolled right after it's mixed. However, because it's able to do that, it is a rather dry mixture and it might need some special treatment, so you'll want to pay attention throughout the demonstration to make sure that you put it together correctly. Sugar cookies use very basic ingredients that are easy to find around most homes: all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, baking powder, salt, shortening, an extra large egg, and vanilla. As we go through the demonstration, I'll tell you what to do if you don't have extra large eggs in your home. This recipe has very little liquid, and so having the right amount of egg in the recipe becomes very important. The equipment that we need for our sugar cookies will include some of the basics: dry measuring cups, measuring spoons, custard cups. If you have it, a Wonder Cup is a great choice for measuring the shortening. We'll need a straight edge spatula, a rolling pin, a cookie sheet, mixing bowl. The pastry blender is going to be very important for this task. Part of the mixing will need a simple fork, and we'll also need a rubber scraper. Then lastly, because it is a cutout sugar cookie, after we roll them out with the rolling pin, we'll need some cookie cutters. Typically those are chosen based to match the time of year or the season or holiday. All right, so let's get started on our sugar cookies. So for our sugar cookies, we need 1 3/4 cup of flour. So there's 1 plus a half, plus a quarter. That makes 3. Half plus a quarter makes 3/4. I also need 3/4 cup of sugar. Half plus a quarter again. I need 3/4 teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking powder. But my 1 teaspoon is wet from vanilla that I already measured, so I'm just going to do the half teaspoon twice. Then I'll sift those 4 ingredients together. And I'll be ready for the next step. Now we're ready for the next step, which is to cut in the shortening. And you can see I measured it in a Wonder Cup, and I like the Wonder Cup because it's easy to pack it in. Make sure you have no air bubbles. It's easy to level off. And then it's also easy to dispense, because all I have to do is push the bottom up and it cleans the sides. If I did not have a Wonder Cup, I would simply use a dry measuring cup in its place and measure my shortening in there. And then anytime your recipe tells me to cut in, I know that means I need my pastry blender. I'm just gonna toss that in a little bit of the flour mixture. And then pastry blender, remember, is a push turn motion. And we're gonna do this until the mixture resembles small peas. And every so often, you'll have to scrape any of the solid fat that got stuck on the pastry blender off. And then every time you do that, remember to drag it through your ingredients. That really helps to stir it up. It gets those larger pieces coated with flour, anything you've broken up, which makes it easier to cut them into the size pieces you need when they're coated in flour. Stir this through a little bit more. And we'll have it right where we want it. Now I mentioned that this mixture does not have a lot of liquid. It's just the egg and vanilla. And if you happen to not have an extra large egg, which is the case for me today, you may have to add a little more egg. You do not want to add milk. You do not want to add water. It will change your cookie. So I'm just going to make a well in the bottom here. And I've already mixed together. I've already put together my egg and vanilla. Now I'm just going to mix those together. And then in the event that I need more egg or more liquid, I have another egg and vanilla mixed together that I can add from. So then I'm just going to use the fork, sort of like we do with pie crust, and bring the rest of this mixture together. I want to try to make sure I get all of this mixed in really well before I decide to add any more liquid from that other egg. So a large egg is what I've used. Most baking, when it asks for an egg, means a large egg, even when it just says egg. And a large egg is about 2 ounces of liquid. An extra large egg is about 2.25 ounces of liquid. So I'm going to go ahead and add another teaspoon of egg mixture. Well, let's make it 2. And we should start to see this come together into a ball. That's our goal before we put it on the counter or the pastry board to roll it out. Now, because it is so dry, or it looks dry, we want to see, you can see if I use my hands, it really comes together pretty nicely. And I don't want to add too much liquid because that'll make it hard to roll out. And I'll end up adding a lot of flour on the board. And that'll make my cookies tough. And we certainly don't want to do that to the cookies. So typically after I get it so far along with the fork, I mix the rest together by hand. And if it's holding together pretty well, when I press on it, then I know it's ready to put onto the floured surface. And then I'm going to roll this out to either somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch thick. I'm going to put a little bit of flour down on my surface. Want to see through it pretty well. Flatten that into a disc first. Cover up that area. Make sure there's flour on top so that my rolling pin doesn't stick. And as I get ready to roll these out, I need to decide what kind of cookie cutters I want to use. So I could use a really large cookie cutter. I wouldn't get very many cookies out of it, but depending on my use for the cookies, that might work out really nicely. I kind of like, this is my favorite, this little white flower. For today, this little tulip isn't bad. Now this flower looks really cute, but one of the things you have to keep in mind when you choose cookie cutters like this are these little tiny pieces. Like this one has this stem, which is going to be more likely to get burnt up in the oven. So I tend to avoid cookie cutters like this, even though they look really cute on the surface. So I'm going to set these aside, and this circle has so many possibilities of what you could do with it. When I'm making these, it's spring, almost summer. You can make a beach ball out of this. You could make other flowers, just smiley faces. You can make a whole bunch of emoji or emoticon cookies. So I like that basic shape because you can get creative with it. So I'm just going to roll this out. It doesn't necessarily have to keep a particular shape. Like if it was a pie crust, I'd really want to keep it round. I'm going to shake my flour out of the container to keep my surface floured. If I grab the flour, then I don't want to put the excess back into anything I don't use back into my container. Because if I grab the flour, there's other ingredients on my hands and I don't want to put that into my flour container. So now that I've got my dough to a nice thickness, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting out my cookies. And I'm going to cut these out as close together as possible. Any cookies I can't cut out, any of the remaining pieces of dough, I will re-roll and cut again. But every time I roll my dough, I make the cookie a little tougher. So I'm going to get as many as I can out of the first cutting before I move them onto the cookie sheet to bake. And have to re-roll the rest. Alright, so I think that's all I'll get out of these cookies. Now we'll move them to the cookie sheet. So for moving my cookies, I'm going to take this nice thin-bladed metal spatula, bent handle spatula or turner, and I'm going to place my cookies fairly close together. These will puff, but they won't really spread like a drop cookie would. So they don't have to be incredibly far apart on your cookie sheet. And the other thing is, I mentioned the different sizes of cookie cutters I have. When you bake your cookies, you want to keep cookies cut to a similar size on the same cookie sheet. So if I were going to make, say, these butterflies and these flowers, then I would make sure that the butterflies baked on their own cookie sheet and the flowers were separate from them. Because if I put them on the same, I'd either take out burnt flowers or unbaked butterflies. So again, you're going to make sure you keep those close in size. And then we have to know how we're decorating our sugar cookies. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. One, you can add sugar, colored sugar before they go in. Or two, you can decorate them with royal or buttercream icing when they come out. So we're going to prepare some of these each way. I set this cookie aside for the next tray. And we're going to take some of these cookies and we're going to use some of the colored sugars that we have. And we're going to decorate them. We put a little colored sugar on before we bake them. Then the sugar stays on the cookie. Some people like this or prefer this because they don't like all the icing. Just like a lighter tasting sugar cookie. And you don't need anything special, just put it on there and it'll hold. You can get creative with your colors, or you can just keep them simple and keep it all one color. Just make sure it's everywhere you want it on the cookie before you put it in the oven, because when it comes out, the only way you'll be able to add colored sugars is if you put a layer of icing on first and then add them on top of the icing. But you could do that. You could just make a white icing and add all of your colored sugar on top of that white icing. And that would be sufficient. Most of these I think I'm just gonna save for the icing. Alright, so we're gonna go ahead and bake these in a 375-degree oven for 8 to 10 minutes. We should start to see the edges brown a little. That'll tell us that they're ready to come out of the oven. So our cookies have finished baking. You can see the sugar that was sprinkled ahead kind of spread out, has a little more vibrant color. You notice the edges are a little bit brown, which gives us a really nice golden color on the bottom. And so that's what we're looking for. We really don't want the top of the cookies to be too brown. We want that blank canvas to start with if we're gonna add icing to them. And again, royal icing or buttercream icing. My favorite is buttercream icing because after it sits for a day, it kind of softens the cookie a little bit more and blends the flavor nicely with the dough. I did mention when you roll them out, you have to roll them between a 1/4 of an inch and an 1/8 of an inch thick. So the thinner you roll your cookie, the crisper it will be. So if you like a nice crisp sugar cookie, you're gonna wanna roll an 1/8 of an inch thick. If you like a soft sugar cookie, you wanna stay closer to a 1/4 of an inch thick. And then just as it was important to keep the size of the cookie cutter the same on a tray, you wanna keep the thickness of the cookie that you rolled the same on each tray that you bake. So you can always, if you wanna have a variety of thicknesses, just make sure you separate those onto separate cookie sheets as you bake. Now these are ready to decorate however you would like. You can even freeze them and save them to decorate up to a month later.